Israel Finkelstein is a leading figure in the archaeology and history of ancient Israel. Over 40 years of fieldwork and research, he has helped to change the way archaeology is conducted, the Bible is interpreted, and the history of Israel is reconstructed. I sat down with Israel over several sessions to talk about how a lifetime of work has informed the story of ancient Israel. Israel, welcome back to the Albright for another discussion.
Matt.
Okay, today we're going to be talking about writing in Israel and Judah. And this is a very timely topic because it has come up in almost every conversation we've had so far. We've always had to say something a little bit extra about the literacy and writing in ancient Israel in order to explain the divergence between the biblical text and the archaeological. In a way, the historical reliability of the biblical text is measured in no small part by how closely in time we can say they were written to the events they portray. What is the history of research concerning literacy and writing in ancient Israel?
Yes, so there is this tension between theories regarding writing in ancient Israel and the composition of biblical text and historicity of biblical stories as you mentioned them. So in the beginning, the idea was that there were scribes in the court of King David and in the court of King Solomon. This came from what? From, first of all, the notion of a great united monarchy, glamorous united monarchy, prospering court with many officials, administration, so why not scribes as well? And of course, in the biblical text, scribes are mentioned in the court of David and in Jerusalem of the time of Solomon. On top of this, we have the theory of Leonard Rost from the beginning of the 20th century regarding the actual texts, the rise of David to power and the succession history in the two books of Samuel as some sort of legitimacy manifesto for David and Solomon. So of course he said they were written in the 10th century. However, there are many problems with these theories because they display basically circular arguments. We don't know really when writing started. We don't know exactly when the earliest composition of biblical text took place. Let's take one example. If indeed the Deuteronomistic historians set in Jerusalem in the late 7th century BC, we need to ask, how did he know about events that took place in the 10th century and whether he did not retrojected realities of his own time, including a scribe in the court in Jerusalem to the time of King David. And of course there is another question, and what if there was no great united monarchy? If all this description of a great Jerusalem and a great united monarchy in the 10th century BC comes from ideology and theology.
So how can we get at this issue? I mean, what are the tools we're going to use?
So we need to turn to archaeology. Surprise. Because archaeology is the only tool that can really provide us with evidence. And when I speak about archaeology, I speak about ancient inscriptions. We have a body of inscriptions. For the very beginning, not so many. We'll speak about it. And for later phases in the history of Israel and Judah, a relatively large number. And we need to put them, to set them into some sort of a stratigraphy, into some sort of a chronological context. And then we can see really when we can trace the first earliest ability to compose literary text. Now this is interesting because when we turn to archaeology, we need to drop all circular arguments, such as, this and that united monarchy in the 10th century. We need to go for the dating of the context, of the strata. So in recent years, my good friend Benjamin Zass and me decided to turn to another way of looking at ancient inscriptions. We are focusing on the stratigraphic context where the inscription was found. Then we are looking at the ceramic typology of the pottery. I mean, what comes from this specific layer. And then we translate the ceramic typology, which provides us only with relative chronology, to absolute chronology by radiocarbon dating. So again, we turn to radiocarbon. Radiocarbon is really pivotal, is really important for giving a date to the inscriptions, to the context. And I think that this is surprising because it goes without saying. It sounds like, the thing to do. But until 6, 7, 10 years ago, archaeology was not in the point of dating inscriptions according to this scheme, this system.
The biblical text as we have it today is in Hebrew, and presumably it was composed in Hebrew as well. But before we get to Israel and Judah and the Hebrew text, we need to step back and talk about the emergence of alphabetic writing in this area first. So start with that, please.
Yes, so we need to go back to the Proto-Canaanite inscriptions. We need to go to the early phase before the rise of Hebrew script. We will see in a few minutes that Hebrew script, we think, Benjamin Zass and me, that Hebrew script can be identified starting in the late 9th century or around 800 BC. So the question is, what before? And for the period before, we have quite a lot of inscriptions to work with. There are altogether about 75, 80 of them mundane inscriptions, and several inscriptions which are more monumental from the second half of the 9th century BC. And these inscriptions cover the entire history of writing from the very beginning of Proto-Canaanite. We will see when exactly, all the way down to 800 BC and the rise of Hebrew, and there are several phases there. And I think that we need first to start with Proto-Canaanite, because Proto-Canaanite is one of the greatest ideas, inventions, if you wish, of humanity. This is the moment when, in our region, here in this land, people had this wonderful idea of taking hieroglyphs from the Egyptians and making them alphabetic signs. And the idea was relatively simple. In the meeting place between, if you wish, Canaanites and Egyptians, the Canaanites saw an Egyptian saying water. In the Semitic it would be mime, starting with a mem, M, and making a sign like this of water, and they took the sign for the mem, and they saw an Egyptian making a hieroglyph of a house, and they said bait, so the sign for the house became a sign for the bet. So this was the beginning, and it's an amazing idea, because all this may come as a surprise to some of our watchers, maybe some of the people watching these conversations, that all scripts of the West, all scripts that we know, starting with the ancient ones, with the Hebrew and Arabic and Phoenician and Moabite and so on, and continuing all the way to Greek and Latin and to the modern scripts of English and the others, they all come from the very beginning here in this land sometime in the second millennium BC.
There's some debate about the dating of the emergence of this Proto-Canaanite alphabet, right?
Indeed, the debate is, there are two debates. The first one is regarding time, and the second is regarding venue. So there are two major theories, because these inscriptions are found here in the southern part of this country, in the area, I would say, of the Shephelah, Lachish, Gaza, southern coastal plain of Israel today. And there are inscriptions like this also in the turquoise mines that the Egyptians operated with the help of Canaanite workers in the Sinai, in the southwestern part of the Sinai Peninsula. So the question is, first of all, whether Proto-Canaanite emerged in the Sinai or near Gaza, and secondly, whether it emerged in the time of the Middle Kingdom in Egypt, which means Middle Bronze in the terminology here of the archaeology of the Southern Levant, or in the Late Bronze Age in the time of the New Kingdom. We are not going to go into this debate right now, because this is not the main topic of the discussion today. I can only say that as far as I can judge, the place to look for the Big Bang of Canaanite scribes meeting Egyptians and seeing hieroglyphs and translating them, so to speak, into signs must be sought in a place where literate people came to Egyptian centers. So I doubt very much if this could have happened in the Sinai Peninsula with illiterate workers coming to help the Egyptians there in the mines. I think that the place to look for is around Gaza, in the south of Canaan. Why Gaza? Because Gaza was the center of the Egyptian administration in the province of Canaan. And we have evidence, including from the Amarna tablets, of Canaanite scribes of the city-states coming to Gaza to dispatch letters to the pharaohs in Egypt. So they could have met, of course, Egyptian scribes, that they could have seen Egyptian monuments with hieroglyphs, and this is the place where things could have started. I suppose sometime in the 14th and 13th centuries BC, or let's put it this way, for sure after the takeover of Canaan by Thutmose III in the middle of the 15th century. This is the way I see it.
At this early point, what are these local Canaanites actually writing with this script?
The beginning is very mundane. What you get is just a very short sentence, a name, a few characters, a few letters, not more than that.
Once the Proto-Canaanite script has been invented, what are the early stages in its development?
There is one more stage before we get to the point that we can speak about Hebrew or Moabite script or Phoenician script. By the way, we are speaking here in this conversation about the script, not the language. Of course, it should be put on the table and clear to the people who watch us. So we are turning now to the next phase, which can be described as a supra-regional cursive. This is the way that my friend Benjamin Zass and I describe it. And the question is when exactly, because Proto-Canaanite lingers into the 9th century. So the 9th century is an important century in the history of development of writing in the Levant. Two major phases took place in the 9th century. In the beginning of the 9th century, possibly, is the gradual shift from Proto-Canaanite to this supra-regional cursive. And in the late 9th century, we are already turning from this supra-regional cursive to the regional variants, which means Hebrew, Moabite, Phoenician, and so on. Now, we need to ask what's the difference between Proto-Canaanite and this supra-regional cursive. There are two differences. First of all, the characters are less pictorial. And secondly, writing is now in one direction, because in Proto-Canaanite you could write from right to left, left to right, up and down, and so on. Now we are turning into a script that is written in one direction and less pictorial than before. And there is another important thing to say about the supra-regional cursive. This is the dissemination of writing from the original place in southern Canaan, around Gaza, in what is today southern part of Israel, to farther to the north, to other parts of the southern Levant. And this happens apparently when we judge according to what we know about the context of the inscriptions and date the inscriptions properly. We see that this happens apparently only in the second half of the 10th century BC. So we have dissemination of Proto-Canaanite, shift to supra-regional cursive, and then in the 9th century we see another thing which is really important, and here we touch already on something which is related to Israel and Judah. Most inscriptions that belong to this phase, to this group that I describe here as supra-regional cursive, come from two places, two big urban centers, probably the most important urban centers of the time. One is Philistine Gat in the southern part of the country, in the southern Shephelah, Gat of the Philistines, and the other one is Rehob, south of Bet Sha'an in the Jordan Valley, which can be described, I think, as at least culturally Aramean related, something like that. Now, there is one more point, and this is where we come close to the beginning of Hebrew and to the two Hebrew kingdoms, Israel and Judah, and surprising, something which is really surprising, in the territory of Israel and Judah, let's say in the 9th century, we know quite a lot already about Israel and Judah at the time. In their territory, both in the highlands and in the lowlands, there is no evidence for writing. No evidence except for an inscription of 1.5 characters from Megiddo. You probably remember from our excavations. So how to explain this? This is really, in a way, strange when we judge this on the background of, let's say, the geopolitical situation in the time of the Omride dynasty in Israel in the first half of the 9th century. The Omrides managed to organize army, big army, to go all the way to Karkar to fight the Assyrians a few hundred kilometers to the north with a big army of chariots. Is it possible that such a kingdom did not have any structure, framework of writing? This is a big question. So some of my colleagues, including some of my good friends and associates, they say, well, in the beginning, writing was only on parchment, papyrus, and so on. And these are perishable materials, so we don't really see them. My answer is that this is an answer, but not a perfect answer. Let's put it this way. And why am I saying this? Because I doubt very much if there is a possibility of writing only in the circles, let's say, of the royal house, let's say at Samaria, on papyri or parchments, and nothing leaking from there to the more mundane writing, which means ostraka, incised inscriptions, seals, seal impressions, bulle, something should have leaked. So I'm leaving this open. We have here a difficulty which needs to be resolved in the future. But right now what we see is that in the territory of the two Hebrew kingdoms, I repeat what I said before, we hardly see, possibility of composition, definitely not of literary texts.
So in this 9th century phase, we don't see inscriptions from Israel and Judah. When do we start to see inscriptions there?
So now we are turning to the kingdoms of Israel and Judah and writing in Israel and Judah. We are getting close to the questions of biblical composition. Let me start with Israel, because Israel comes before. We have evidence for writing in Israel about half a century or even a century before we see this in Judah. And this is not surprising because Israel was more developed from the point of view of material culture, economy, trade relations with the lands, neighboring lands, international roads, and so on. So in the northern kingdom, in Israel, we see Hebrew inscriptions because we are now in the phase that we can identify the script as the Hebrew variant. We see Hebrew inscriptions starting in around 800 BC. Maybe very late 9th century, beginning of the 8th century, and we are speaking about mainly two corpora. The first one is the Samaria ostraka. These are sherds inscribed with ink, and they speak about shipments of oil and wine from the countryside to the center, to the capital of the kingdom at Samaria. We have about 100 of them. Most of them were found in the course of the Harvard expedition to Samaria in the beginning of the 20th century. Then we have another corpus, which is a little bit surprising because it comes from the far south. I'm speaking here about the site of Kuntilet Ajrud, located in the northeastern part of the Sinai Peninsula, far to the south. It is located on one of the main roads which lead from the south, from the desert, to the coast. And from the material culture point of view, and also from the inscriptions, we see that the site is affiliated more with the northern kingdom, with Israel, than with Judah, although it is located in the south. Now, and there are a few more here and there, a few more inscriptions, but this is the main body for the beginning of the 8th century. The interesting thing is that we see the beginning of Hebrew variant, and about the same time already we see ability to compose literary text. And we see this in two places. First of all, at Kuntilet Ajrud there is at least one inscription which is of literary nature, character. And then of course we see another inscription which maybe is cannot be exactly described as Hebrew, but it comes from the territory of Israel, of the northern kingdom. And I refer here to the Tel Dir Allah plaster inscription, which evokes the seer Balaam mentioned in the Bible in the book of Numbers. So this is typically a literary inscription, and it dates to the beginning of the 8th century. So in my view, as far as I can judge, this is the time that we can already speak about composition of biblical texts. And because Israel then was so prosperous, and because we see evidence for centralization of administration and the power of the royal court at this time, I'm speaking now about the time of a king, Jeroboam II, who ruled in Israel for about 40 years, more than 40 years at that time. I think that the very beginning of composition of biblical text is in his time, and we will touch on this in one of our future conversations, time of Jeroboam II. And this is really highly important because it can explain not only the beginning of composition of biblical text and the fact that some of the earliest traditions in the Bible seem to have originated in the territory of Israel rather than in Judah and around Jerusalem. It is also a very important moment for understanding the cultural impact of Israel on Judah. There is one more point important to say. You know that there is this field of research of paleography, trying to understand the development of script and sometimes trying to go into very minute differences between half a century here and there. I think that for both Israel and Judah, this is highly risky. And the reason that I'm saying is, come think about the inscriptions of the Northern Kingdom that we know of Israel. So we speak about Samaria. We have recently conducted an algorithmic project to try to identify the number of scribes who wrote the Samaria Ostraka. We reached the conclusion that we are speaking about 2 scribes sitting in the center, in the capital, and registering, the shipments that came from the countryside. So 2. Kontilet Ajrud is a single building in the middle of the desert. So how many scribes could have lived there? 1, 2. There is another ostrakon shared inscribed with ink at Bet She'an. So altogether we are dealing with a very limited number of scribes, and I doubt very much whether we can really produce real paleography for this limited number of people who could write.
And you say that Judah lags behind Israel.
Indeed. Judah lags behind Israel on many fronts. Judah, as we said before, is less developed than Israel, and everything in Judah is a little bit later, pops up a little bit later than in Israel. However, we can say for sure that there is writing, administrative writing, and writing in the circles of the court in Jerusalem as early as the late 8th century. And there are 2 reasons for this statement. The first one is the famous Siloam inscription, describing the cutting of the Siloam tunnel. It was found in the late 19th century, and it is now on display in the museum in Istanbul. This is a royal inscription any way you look at it. And then there is the whole system of the Lamelech, to the king, inscriptions, the seal impressions on the handles of storages of the kingdom. This dates to the late 8th century, let's say after the Assyrian takeover, any way we look at it. So there is evidence for writing in the late 8th century, however, not yet in the countryside of Judah.
And nothing before this period?
Oh yes, before. So here we touch on another very sensitive point of dealing with the beginning of Hebrew writing. Because until a few years ago, me too, if you asked me about the beginning of writing, I would have said to you, yes, we need to look at Arad. And why is that? Arad is a fort in the southern part of Judah, in the Beersheba Valley, in the desert part of Judah. And in excavations there in the 60s, the excavator Aharoni found a very impressive number of Hebrew ostraka. Again, sherds inscribed with ink, with lists of names, and again shipment of commodities to military units, and 1 or 2 even maybe touching on historical questions. Now, we knew for a long time now that most of these inscriptions, also around 100 give or take, most of them date to the 7th century BC. However, Aharoni argued that there are several inscriptions that go with the earlier layers that start with the late 10th century and more so in the 9th century. And in fact, the whole structure of the study of Hebrew, writing in Hebrew, the Hebrew script, was for many years based on those several inscriptions that ostensibly come from the earlier layers at Arad. In recent months, I decided to start looking at this very carefully. Again, at the stratigraphy, and again at the pottery repertoire, which means the context where the inscriptions came from. And I did this with my student and now colleague, Dr. Asaf Kleiman. And we came to the conclusion, we really went into the details, into the nitty-gritty of the stratigraphic information regarding each of these early supposedly inscriptions, and we came to the conclusion, to make a long story short, there is not even a single inscription at Arad that can be dated before the late 8th century. In fact, most of them date in the 7th century. In fact, there are few inscriptions at Arad that can be dated, securely dated, in the late 8th century. In fact, when we zoom out from Arad and we look broader at Judah, there are inscriptions from other places. Altogether, there is a big number of ostraka shirts inscribed in, with ink from Judah, several hundreds of them. And altogether, scrutinizing all the information from Beersheba in the south, from Arad, from Lachish in the west, the second city of Judah, from Jerusalem. In fact, we can really pinpoint on only a few ostraka which can really be dated to the late 8th century. So we are dealing with most of them, 95% of them, if not more, in the 7th century BC. And also the same holds true for the incised inscriptions and the bulle and the seal impressions and so on. So what do we see here? We can see that writing indeed started in Judah and disseminating in Judah in the late 8th century BC, but the main phase is in the 7th century, when you can really see the dissemination of writing throughout the skeleton of the Judahite administration, of the Judahite military. And here we contributed also, my group at Tel Aviv University, meaningfully, significantly in recent years, because we ran another algorithmic study of the Arad corpus, and we tried to identify the number of hands of authors among, about 18 Arad inscriptions, those inscriptions which have enough letters really to run the test, the algorithmic study. We came to the conclusion that there were like 5 or 6 people who could write in the godforsaken fort, small fort at Arad. Listen, we are speaking about a fort where the garrison was about 25 people, 30 people, something like this. Among them, 4, 5, 6 can write. Then we did another study, a forensic study, with forensic methods on the inscriptions, and we identified a few more. So there are even more than 5 or 6 who could actually write in this place. Not only that, when we turn from the algorithmic study to the content of the inscriptions, we saw that the ability to write goes down the Judahite administration or military administration, from the highest commanders sitting in Jerusalem or the commander sitting in Beersheba, in the Beersheba Valley, and then to the commander at Arad, all the way down to the second in line in the storeroom, the storage facility of Arad, which is really quite amazing. So we are dealing with dramatic dissemination of writing in Judah in the 7th century, which is important for our discussion regarding composition of biblical texts, including the Deuteronomistic history, the earliest version of which was apparently put in writing, composed in Jerusalem at that time in the late 7th century.
The first time that we see writing and inscriptions in Judah is in the late 8th century, which is, of course, after the fall of the northern kingdom of Israel. Would you suggest that writing as a tool is coming from Israel into Judah?
Indeed, I think that we can say this or suggest this. You are now turning to the question of why in the late 8th century in general and the 7th century, and I think that the fall of the Northern Kingdom is essential for understanding this process, this development. Why? Because I think that with the takeover of the Northern Kingdom by Assyria, there were people from the Northern Kingdom, refugees who ran away to Judah. We see this very clearly in the big boom in the urbanism in Jerusalem, in the size and demographic, the population of Jerusalem starting in the late 8th century. We see this in the big boom in the number of sites and demography in the countryside, in the highlands and the Shephelah of Judah. So where did these people come from? And we see this also in the material culture. We can identify impact of northern material culture on Judah starting in the late 8th century. Now, we need also to ask the question of who were the people who ran away from Samaria, let's say, to Jerusalem. And the answer would be, why should, a simple farmer run away from his land and from his house and from his village? Only the literati, only the intelligentsia, they were in the danger, in the risk of being deported, and they ran away. So deportation was a big risk for them. They came to Judah, they brought with them writing, knowledge of writing, advanced knowledge of administration, also, in my opinion, early biblical compositions, which were later incorporated into the Judahite-dominated biblical text. So this is the background, one side of the story. The fall of Israel is really important for understanding this big boom of writing and, generally speaking, development in Judah. The second is the incorporation of Judah into the Assyrian economy, into the Assyrian Empire. Judah was a compliant vassal of Assyria, starting in 732 with Tiglath-Pileser III. This is also the reason why it was not taken over completely by Assyria, but only made a vassal. And Judah was, when I say Judah was incorporated, it was incorporated into the economic system of Arabian trade from the south, of specialization in agricultural output and industries in the kingdom, let's say between wine and oil and other commodities. And all this called for developed advanced administration and also writing. So the very incorporation of Judah into the Assyrian economy, together with the migration of people from Israel, these were the reasons for the developments in Judah, starting in the late 8th century and more so in the 7th century BC.
Let's summarize what we've talked about in this session.
To summarize, okay, so we spoke about different themes today. Let's focus now in the summary on the Hebrew script. Hebrew appears in the late 9th century, second half of the 9th century, beginning of the 8th century. We see the Hebrew first most significantly in the Northern Kingdom in Israel, where we see significant writing in the first half of the 8th century, including possibility to compose biblical texts. Then we see the impact of Israel on Judah, the migration of literate Israelites into Judah after the takeover of Israel by Assyria in 720. And this was the beginning of dissemination of writing also in the Southern Kingdom in Judah. In the south, in Jerusalem and the surrounding, first earliest evidence for composition of administration texts in the very late 8th century. First evidence for composition of a literary text in the 7th century, and in any event, the significant dissemination of writing in Judah, which really sheds light on biblical composition, is only in the 7th century. And all this package that I'm describing here is really important, critical for understanding the stages of development of the Hebrew Bible From the phase we can theorize about composition of text in the north, in Israel, in the time of Jeroboam, second perhaps, in the first half of the 8th century, then transmission of these texts with Israelites who came to Judah, incorporation of these texts into the Judahite-dominated biblical text, and more composition, important composition of biblical text in Judah only starting in the very late 8th century and more so in the 7th century, including the Deuteronomistic history in the very late 7th century BC.
All right, so it seems fitting that we're going to end with Judah, because next time we're going to pick up with Jerusalem. Thanks, Israel. See you next time.
Thank you.